You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little puppets dance to every song he sings as the night falls.
Good morning, America. It is Connecting the Dots Tuesday, and it is February 26th, and today we have a couple of guests on that have been on the radio program before, but we're going to be talking about an important subject for America, and that is now that the lunatics are officially running the asylum, now that we have the Democratic Socialists of America running the Congress, we've got a serious problem. And, of course, it's the same problem that we've been talking about for the last 30 years and really longer than that. But the fact is that they called us lunatics for even talking about this. And they said that we were just a bunch of conspiracy theorists and that we were alarmists and that we were talking through our hats, our tinfoil hats. Well, guess what? Everything that we talked about is now becoming reality, and this new so-called new program called the Green New Deal that's coming out of the progressive left is nothing more than a rehash of UN Agenda 21 that's been around for almost 30 years. And the fact is that they are really causing a problem. And they are in the process of destroying our country because they are implementing all of these programs that are part of UN Agenda 21, and they are part of a program to deindustrialize the United States of America, redistribute our wealth, take complete control of every aspect of human life in the United States and around the world, and control literally everything we eat, see, breathe, hear, and touch from cradle to grave. And that is the subject of today's show. And because, and the fact that in South Africa, they've already been through this. They went through this in 1994, 93, and they transferred the power to the same people who are now openly communist and requesting that all land be taken away from the white farmers there and given to the collective. And they are doing the same things there that they plan to do here. And so all I can say is that we've lived it before in another country. And Dr. Harry Booyens is our guest today, along with Alex Newman. And we are going to be talking about this subject because Harry has seen it firsthand, and so has Alex, because Alex is an investigative journalist with the New American Magazine. He lived in South Africa, and he knows exactly how that country has transitioned over the last 25 to 30 years and how it is impacting that country, and now we're seeing the same things happen in the United States. Harry, good morning to the radio show, and I'd love to, with that lead in, have you kind of talk about some of the things that you are seeing in the United States that are nothing more than a rehash of what you saw in South Africa.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me. Just having some trouble with Skype. I don't know whether you can hear me at all. Maybe you should just answer that question first.
I hear you fine.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to shut my sound off. All I'm getting is a lot of hissing and noise. I think you were asking, what makes me think I'm seeing in the U.S. what I've seen before in South Africa. In 1994, everybody went to vote. It's the new great democratic thing. Everybody in the country is going to get their chance. No more trouble with apartheid or any of that stuff. And everybody went to the voting booth, did our thing. Lo and behold, nobody was killed in the process. And everything seemed, as the Brits would say, hunky-dory. And about 3 years later, we started seeing things happen that were worrisome. For example, controlling political officers being placed in workplaces. And then later on, laws started getting made that actively discriminated against people based on the color of their skin. In this case, having a white skin would be a blight on your life. And it's only got worse from there. So round about the 2007, I guess it was, I started worrying about some of the sounds I was hearing out of the United States. And by the end of 2008, you folks had voted in a new president who had said that he'd been inspired by South Africa, and he used that word repeatedly. And I thought it would be a wonderful thing if the first black president of America could tell this new government in South Africa, lay off, behave, etc., etc. But he didn't. He started essentially fating them. And I thought, something's wrong here. If there was a bottle around this genie, the bottle's gone. And sure enough, after a while, you started seeing things like Ferguson in Missouri. And my comment to you would be that as a South African, the only difference I saw between those events and South Africa in the 1980s is that this time around I was seeing the movie reels in color. And to rub it in even more deeply, the I don't know what one calls them, the armored vehicles that the police were using were in fact based on South African technology. It was that close. And as though that event wasn't enough, it went further, and in 2015, very early, we had a situation where specifically the black students at Cape Town University said that the statue of Cecil John Rhodes had to go. Now, I hate that man in history. I mean, he was the cause of the death of my family, but I wouldn't tear his statue down. But these kids were jumping up and down and saying the statue should be torn down, and the weak-kneed University of Cape Town tore the statues down. Within a couple of days, the University of Berkeley Black Student Union expressed solidarity with those students, and soon after, by early 2017 or in 2017, your statues started coming down. So I'm seeing South Africa crawl into the heart and soul of America, and I had to flee there. So the monster that I got away from is in your country. And now you've got people like this little Cortez girlie, Ocasio-Cortez, who sounds like the black first, land first people in South Africa who's threatening everybody. The kind of stuff she speaks is the kind of stuff we're hearing in South Africa. It is as though someone in the United States is lapping up every single thing that's gone wrong in South Africa and is exporting it to you guys. And my worry is that Americans don't recognize it. Sorry, that's a long response, but that's it. I feel like I'm reliving this.
Well, Harry, that's not a long response, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today, is how this progressive socialism, this communism, this Marxism, we can call it whatever we want, but all roads lead to Rome, and the fact is that it's all a new Marxism, and it is worldwide, and the fact is that we've been living it for the last 100-plus years in a big way, and the progressives have finally wormed their way so thoroughly throughout our culture, in the news media, in education, in the political process, throughout the whole system. They've wormed their way in, and now the world sees a new vision under progressive socialism, a new world order. And it isn't one political party or the other. Quite frankly, I think they both sleep in the same bed, and I think they share a lot of the same progressive ideas. But the fact is, this system is designed to destroy individualism and capitalism. And the things that have made our world and our culture successful and has allowed people to crawl out of the primordial slime and actually live decent lives is a result of that capitalism, that individualism, and they are destroying it. And if they succeed, we will be living in a totally different world, and it will be happening so fast that average Americans will look like they've been smacked with a fish. They won't have a clue until it's too late, and then they're going to say, gee, how did this happen?
Well, I sent you a list of clips that relates to this, and hopefully we'll get to one of those. Exactly this.
Well, Harry, I'm hoping that Alex is on the call too. I know he was having a little trouble calling in. Alex, are you there?
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't sound like Alex is on the call yet. We'll try to get him on the call because what he's got to contribute is immense. So, Harry, let's talk about the things that happened very gradually in South Africa and how you see the parallels between those gradual takeovers that destroyed the free market system in South Africa. And incidentally, tell our listeners just exactly how communist South Africa is today. And it was a beacon of anti-communism for a century. And now it is controlled by the communists.
Well, I got to think about whether I explain the takeover or whether I explain the present condition. Maybe the present condition is too big a mental leap for Americans to make, too big a cultural leap. I shouldn't say mental. Once upon a time, there was a country at the southern tip of Africa. I refer to it as the Second America because that's the title the Brits gave it. And by the time I was born, it was a country where a farmer could take his produce, put it next to the side of the road, put a little open box there and say, oranges, $2 a bag, please put the money in this little box. And he'd be okay, there wouldn't be a penny missing. That was the nature of the place. And yes, it had big trouble on the racial front, but it wasn't the kind of trouble that the United States had. It was a case of two civilizations, in effect, competing, but that's a story for another day. Slowly, folks realized that this situation couldn't continue like that. But the reality is that even before I was born, the military leader of this crowd that wished to take over the country had already sent to Red China for help. The Red Chinese pragmatically turned him down. His name was Nelson Mandela. You never hear this part of the story, but you'll find it in the books about him, and even his own. And so that was around 1952. By the late 1950s, they were peaceful resistance meetings. There's always this bit about peaceful resistance. But the fact is, it was so peaceful that they actually killed a Dominican nun and basically ate of her body. You had cannibalism in that process. And you don't have to believe me. People can just go to Google and put in their system Mary Aidan, A-I-D-A-N. Add the word East London, which is where it happened. So much for peaceful. This was at the same time, roughly, as the Mau Mau stuff in Kenya, in which your President Obama's grandfather was involved. So by 1964, this crowd had been caught. They were basically, they probably should have been hanged. They would have been hanged or put in an electric chair if it were the United States. But under South African law, they were given a life sentence and sent to Robben Island. And there Mandela would sit for some 26 years while the world turned him into a saint. Now, the time it got to the early 80s, the nastiest of these race-based laws had been removed. The only stuff that really remained is things to do with voting and power. And when it got to the year 1990, the then president, F.W. de Klerk, was the guy who then in early January 1990 announced that he's going to allow the Communist Party to participate in things. He's going to allow the ANC party of Mandela to participate in things. They are no longer banned. And he freed Mandela from jail. And of course, the whole world went completely nuts and cheered and carried on. In 1994, Mandela won this first complete open election, and everything sounded really nice for about 2 years. I can tell you that during 1995, you're asking me how I experienced it. During 1995, we started appointing our first affirmative action, as it was called then, people. We hired a guy out of IBM, came with incredibly good credentials, put him on the job, and my colleague, who was his manager, came back one day and said, I don't understand. I can't get this guy to do a thing. There is just nothing he seems to be able to do. And but as far as I can tell, he's competent, but there's just nothing coming out. And it got worse and worse until the man became almost a project for our entire division, how to make this man useful. And then suddenly one morning, and here's how you become aware of these things. Suddenly one morning I get a telephone call from the big boss of the organization. I had worked directly with him some years before, about 5 years before. He phones me up and he says, Harry, tell me about that guy called whatever. in your division. And I told him, but, you know, I'm not his boss. You should speak to so-and-so. He's the manager for the guy. And he says, well, I can't repeat on the air what he said, but he told me, Harry, cut the whatever. I'm talking to you. You know me, I know you, I want to know what's going on. What's with this guy? And I told him, well, you know, the trouble is he was appointed, came with great credentials out of IBM, thought it was going to work real well. We've all tried. This guy basically just sits there. We can't figure it out. And we can't fire him because you'd be called a racist if you did that. It's just a reality where I come from. And so I must say that folks are going to have to forgive me if I'm not politically correct. The part of the world I come from, if you get politically correct and you miss the facts, you die. Now, I asked him, but why are you so interested in the guy? And he says, well, I got a phone call last night to say that as from tomorrow morning, I, as the president of the company, will report to Winnie Mandela through him. That is what you would call a wake-up call. That's when you know something is very badly wrong. I thank God today that I lived that because it allowed me to see the monster coming early. Winnie Mandela eventually lost her job. Even her famous husband couldn't stand it any further. And after all, you know, she has been involved with something like 12 murders around her place. So life went on. And the next moment, a law was made that said if you're a white guy and you've got a company, you have to give around half of the shares in your company to some suitable black person. And usually there is a queue of suitable black people who are listed and approved coming from the government. So basically, of your life to these guys who are lining up to take it, right? And as though that wasn't bad, they started threatening the farmers, and then the farmers were starting to get killed. And then it turned, and now we have a situation where South African farmers are tortured to death. Can I just check that you're hearing all of this, Dan?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because I'm hearing a lot of noise out of my sound system. Okay, so it's like things escalated. Folks talk about the boiled frog syndrome. I swear to you that when the first kind of steps happen, you sort of do a little bit of a double take, and then you take a drink of water and you think, chill out, you know, it's no big deal. Don't get paranoid. You know, but the correct response probably, you know, just because you think you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. They are. And so life went on, but I'd already packed up in 2000 because I could see what was happening. Things were happening in the workplace that were just outrageous. I was confronted by one of these planted guys, because that's what that man was that I talked about earlier. He's a plant. Okay, he's a political officer. So he was planted in the workplace, and another one that was placed directly around me confronted me one day in front of some black colleagues who had a lot of respect for me and I for them. And he told me to my face in their presence, our purpose is to get rid of people like you. You got to go. I found myself in the interesting situation where an Indian man from India walked into my office and told me, Harry, you have to be really careful. This is no longer a country for a white man. You know what it feels like to hear that? So
no, I don't. But I think we're going to find out.
So that's what happened, and I'm sorry for the fact that skin color comes into my statements all the time. But the government down there puts us in these categories and then tries to get white people killed. it kind of doesn't help to pretend there isn't a color issue. It's an outright, out-and-out brazen matter of color. There is no more dodging around it. So I'm going to call it the way it is. Now, to bring it closer to you folks, and I can see Alex has joined us, we've now got to the point where there is not just a fringe group asking that the property of people be taken away because they're white. We now have the president of the country going on television and announcing, and to Parliament, that the property of white people be expropriated without compensation. We are now there. We're at the end of the step. After that, all they basically just need to do is kill us, right? And when you hear the one clip I've lined up for you, you will get it in words of one syllable from the people who want this to happen. And if you don't think this little Ocasio-Cortez girlie is headed the same way, you got another thing coming.
Well, Harry, one of the things that comes out of the progressive movement is that the only thing progressive about them is that they are progressively forcing us into a system of total control. And it's their control that is important to them. It's just that simple. And I know one of the comments that she's made is that virtually no one in this country belongs here except for the indigenous people. Well, the whole world is constantly in a state of flux, and there's been migrations of people literally since the very beginning. That's part of the process. But I know that one of the things that you've written in your history of South Africa is the fact that when your settlers, your forefathers, settled in South Africa, it was almost 100 years before they saw their first black person. And they settled in an area that was completely wide open. It wasn't a matter of them taking the land from the blacks. The blacks didn't want it because it wasn't good for grazing cattle and for producing milk.
Well, in a nutshell, as far as that history is concerned, when the Dutch settled at Cape Town in 1652, the nearest black people were 700 miles away at the southern end of what is now the province of KwaZulu-Natal. There were other black people more towards the inland areas, and they were also roughly 700 miles away, a completely different black nation. So between the Dutch and those guys was territory that's not amenable to cattle, because it looks mostly like southern Nevada and parts of New Mexico. And the end result is that the black folks were at that point still moving south. They had slowly progressed southwards from the equatorial regions of Africa. And by the time the white people had spread eastward and the black people had spread southwestward, they met at a point that's roughly 600 miles, 500 to 600 miles east of Cape Town. And, you have no idea how many times American folks and Canadian folks have told me, you arrived there and settled at Cape Town and displaced the black people who are the proper owners of the land. It's rubbish. It's a lie. It's a brazen, 100% unmitigated lie.
No, that's right. And incidentally, I think everyone in America needs to read your book because they can see a progressive, no pun intended, history that really shows how the system broke down and how communism really took over. Now it virtually controls the whole continent. I mean, there's very, very few countries in Africa who are not either communist or under a totalitarian dictator. I hear the music coming on. Alex, I hear that you were on. We'll pick it up on the other side of the break with Alex Newman.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests on the radio program are Dr. Harry Booyens and Alex Newman. And we were talking about South Africa and the parallels with what has been happening in the United States over the last 10 or 15 years. And Alex actually is a writer for the New American Magazine, among many other credentials that he has. But I read a book review that Alex wrote a number of years back. I think it's probably now 4 years ago, maybe 5, about Dr. Booyen's book, Amapulu. And he did a book review, and I was fascinated when I read that book review, and I thought, wow, I need to buy this book, and I need to read it. Well, I read it, and through that, I managed to connect with Dr. Booyens, and we have become friends since then. And of course, I'm also friends with Alex Newman. But I really appreciate the fact that Alex, as a world traveler, has such a very, very fresh perspective on what is happening around the world. And I know that, Alex, you and I have talked about this. I think you're just about as appalled by the recent elections in the United States and how they've impacted our whole political system, and how really we are moving so quickly into their progressive socialist New World Order that it should alarm every American, and we ought to be up in arms. Alex, welcome to the show, and please join the conversation and tell us your perspective on the things that have been happening recently.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Dan. And Harry, it's great to hear your voice and to be with you guys on this show. I really appreciate everything you guys are both doing. And, I'm glad we get to have this conversation about South Africa. I used to live there. I learned probably more from Dr. Booyens than I did in my time being there. But, I think what's happening, if you want to understand really what's happening, not just to South Africa, but to America and to Western Europe and to what we used to call, Western civilization or Western Christian civilization, you really need to understand what is happening in South Africa. It is essentially the blueprint that they intend to use in so many different ways to bring down all of our societies in terms of fomenting strife, in terms of taking away private property rights, redistributing wealth, in terms of advancing globalism. And what you have happening in South Africa is really, I think, a microcosm of what is going to happen to the Western Christian civilization as we move closer to this one world order that the globalists are always talking about. You have a situation now where the Afrikaner people have been completely disenfranchised. They have no control over their own destiny anymore. They're a tiny minority in their own country, and they are now at the complete mercy of people who come from radically different cultures with radically different religious views and beliefs and heritage. And there's not much they can do about it anymore, except for maybe try to secede and declare independence, which, we can imagine how the United Nations and the United States government and the European Union might respond to that. So I think we need to recognize that what is happening to the Afrikaner people right now is what is going to be happening to, what remains of Western Christian civilization around the world if this globalist agenda continues marching onward. Can you imagine if, you have the head of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, who just stepped down recently. They put in a new socialist in his place, Antonio Guterres. But towards the end of his term, he was running around the world talking about the United Nations as if it were what he calls the Parliament of Humanity. If we accept this idea of a Parliament of Humanity, we need to recognize that even if it were proportional representation, Americans would have about a 5% vote within this architecture of global governance. The great majority of the votes would be controlled by populations that have no experience, no heritage with Christian civilization and individual liberty in the sense that Americans do, dating back to our founding fathers. And so we would very quickly find ourselves overwhelmed. Our wealth, our resources would be voted out from under our feet, and we would be in the exact same situation that the Afrikaner is in right now, unable to control their own destiny, on the verge of losing everything, and unable to even maintain their own civilization, their own traditions, their own culture, their own language. We need to recognize how dangerous this is. This is an existential threat to all of us and to our liberties as well. So I think that's my big concern here, and I think Harry really, through the insights that he has brought to the table, through his historical understanding of what has happened in South Africa, the history of South Africa, I think if you want to get a sneak preview of what's in store for America, read Harry Bouillin's book, and I think you'll have a very clear picture of where all of this is going. And it's incredible. They're even using a lot of the same strategies. I wrote extensively in the New American about South Africa, and then I also wrote extensively in the New American about how the United Nations is using these quote-unquote indigenous peoples as a pretext, as a battering ram to break down the United States. This is what we're seeing now in South Africa. It's largely based on lies. This idea that the European settlers had stolen all the land and whatnot. We see the same thing happening in America now. It's a little bit more subtle, but you have, for example, the UN Treaty on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And if you actually read this, if you read it, it literally says that every piece of territory that was ever owned or used or walked upon by Native Americans needs to be returned to Native Americans. Well, if you interpret that literally, which you're supposed to do with these treaties, that would mean every square inch of the North American continent would have to be returned to Native Americans. It's not that the UN has any particular affinity for Native Americans, but they recognize that this is a useful tool. And so that's just one example of the parallels between what we're seeing. Now we're seeing the open borders, where they're trying to flood the United States and Europe with peoples from other cultures and other religions and other languages and other worldviews. And, it's a very, very dangerous situation we're in. Nobody wants to talk about it because they're scared somebody's going to call them a bad name. But it is, absolutely essential that we begin talking about this or we're going to lose it all.
You're right on, Alex. And the thing is that, we talk about the transfer back to the indigenous peoples of all the lands, and what they've done in South Africa is literally destroy the agricultural base, which was huge. I mean, South Africa used to feed most of Africa. It was the breadbasket, and Rhodesia under Ian Smith was the same thing. They were very, very productive agricultural area. They worked under free market principles, and now under collectivism, those farms are being destroyed. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union under collectivism. Same thing happened when the Ukrainians in the 1920s and 30s were literally starved to death on their own land because the collectivists wanted to control the whole farming process in the Ukraine. And we see these things are failed policies. They don't make any sense at all if you're interested in feeding people. But the fact is, I think a lot of people are starting to understand this is about population reduction. This is about destroying the economic and the food base that feeds the world. And if you control the food, you can control population, you can control everything. Harry, I want you to weigh in on that too.
Yeah, Dan, I was wondering if I could come at this from just a slightly different angle here.
Oh, please do. This is about open discussion.
Yeah. The point is this: why are things that are completely irrational why are they finding acceptance with otherwise intelligent people? Why is it that this Cortez girlie can speak absolute drivel and people find it acceptable? Why is it that my folks can be murdered in the most despicable ways and folks find it acceptable? There's something underlying this thing, and I call it the beast. And I have a couple of notes here in front of me that I'd like to share, because I think I know where the beast was born, and I think how and where exactly it grew up in sort of quiet. Because for me,
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, for me, the realization started in late 1979 at IBM in New York, where I was a visiting postdoc student. For South Africa, it in the year 1800. For the Western world, it started in the 1700s, and in Britain specifically, 1783. And I'll tell you why I picked those dates. The IBM Yorktown Heights event for me. I shared an office with a communist Danish professor. And after talking about South Africa, one day I asked him, so what do you expect us to do? This is the situation we find ourselves in. What is it you want from us? Tell me, lay it out. And he rose to his full 6'5" and he said, you are a sick anachronism and a blot on the name of Europe. You should just die. Okay, so if I'm a sick anachronism, it means I remind him of something out of his own past. So the problem is, it's an issue with him, not with me. He says a blot on the name of Europe, so it's all about Europe, not about South Africa. Now, to understand the reaction of that man, we have to go back to where this beast was born. And that was in the late 1700s in France with the French philosophers. And I want to quote you the little line from a book by a Frenchman on a horse in my part of the world, the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, in the year 1782. This man is completely under the sway of the thinking of the French philosophers, who had this idea of the noble savage. So the civilized Christian white man is a problem, everybody else is okay, right? You can't tell me you haven't heard that recently. So here's what he wrote. He says, in every where the natives live entirely unconnected with the whites, he said whites, not me, it's his words. In every part where the natives live entirely unconnected with the whites, their manners are mild and amiable. On the contrary, an acquaintance with Europeans alters and corrupts their natural character, which amazingly, he actually says amazingly, it doesn't occur to him that he's talking drivel, which amazingly degenerates. And this remark, which is a melancholy truth, seldom admits of an exception. Now, it's striking to me that this representative of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's noble savage school of thought would write this kind of drivel, even as the very black Amakosa people he was talking about were killing one another in droves just a few miles away. So now this present half-blind, psychotic, guilt-based behavior on the part of many people, especially the left, it therefore comes a long way. It was born in the minds of the 18th century French philosophers. And it always remains intriguing to me how much those French philosophers could expound on the nobility of savages without ever meeting one. You know, I'm the guy who comes from the place where this garbage happened. I'm the guy who got burnt by it, okay? I now live in Canada, and I'm surrounded by what, as far as I'm concerned, naive children. And if you want to see what impact that kind of thing had, as far back as that, because that's where this all comes from. By 1783, 80% of Britain's economy was still based on the slave. So much for their wonderful Industrial Revolution. 1783, still 80% of the economy on slaves. So given that they championed the cause of slavery, they now convinced themselves, in philosophers, that Africa was where they had to go to atone and be absolved. And even their prime minister, old William Pitt, wrote in one of the supposedly great speeches of mankind, "How shall we hope to obtain, if it be possible, forgiveness from heaven for the enormous evils we have committed, if we refuse to make use of those means which the mercy of Providence has still reserved for us, for wiping away the shame and guilt with which we are now covered?" Well, they did nothing to wipe away their shame and guilt. What they did is they sent their weirdly debauched missionary company to South Africa to start create all the garbage that you now see happening. This whole thing is built on a sense of guilt of the left. It is a psychotic state that these people cannot shake. So any idiot who doesn't look like them and who walks in with some demand gets it. You are automatically assumed to be wrong, bad, and evil if you are white and Christian. And it's the way it is now in America, it is the way it is in Canada, and it certainly is the way in South Africa, where we're dying.
No, Harry, I see the same things that you see, and that is that the so-called progressives, the liberals, are the ones that have this guilt complex, and they want everyone else to pay the price. They don't want to pay the price. They avoid paying the price themselves, but they want everyone else to pay the price.
Correct. And the more Christian you are, the higher the price you have to pay.
Right, right. Alex, I want you back in on this conversation because I know you've got some very strong feelings in this regard. Please tell us how you feel this white guilt has been manifest.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Harry. And I think Harry just hit on something that is so important. And I think what we're really seeing more than anything, it kind of takes the form of being anti-white, but I think, and I think in South Africa, that's the term that is used as kind of a catch-all. But I don't think they really just hate people for having less melanin in their skin than other people. I think the real issue here, and this is my view as a Christian, as somebody who believes in Jesus Christ and believes himself to be part of the Church of Jesus Christ, I think what we're really seeing here is a hatred against God and a hatred against the church and a hatred against everything that God has ordained. And so in certain contexts, especially in South Africa and increasingly in the Americas as well, and I think we'll see this a lot more in Australia and New Zealand too, I think the demonization of white people has much more to do with the fact that they are associated, or at least their civilization is associated with Christianity. And I would argue, first of all, there's nothing inherently white about Christianity. In fact, Jesus came from the Middle East. He was a Semitic person. He would probably look a lot like a Middle Eastern person today. So there's nothing inherently white about Christianity. But because it was Europe that basically took the gospel to every corner of the earth, to all across Africa, all across Asia, all across the Americas, all the way into Oceania with Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. I mean, it was Europeans primarily who spread the gospel around the world, after, of course, the apostles who had kind of ventured into Asia and into Europe. But I think that is why we're seeing now this demonization of everything associated with Europe. I don't think they mind things from Europe that don't necessarily have any connection to God or godliness or the Bible. They don't complain about the technology that's come out of Europe. Nobody complains about, how come we have to use these dumb computers? How come we have to drive cars? Nobody complains about those things. But what they do complain about is, this alleged legacy, which, they try to paint as bad and evil of taking Christianity all over the world. And of course, the fruit of that Christian civilization. And all of this goes right back to what God has ordained, right? I mean, if you look at the things that God has ordained, those are all of the things that, I don't know about Harry's religious beliefs, and I don't think it's relevant here, but if you look at the things that God has ordained in the Bible, things like family, things like marriage, things like the nation state, things like private property, things like an inherent value to human life, right? And I mean, this is all very clear from the Bible. You read, for example, even the Ten Commandments that everybody knows. God said, "Thou shalt not murder," and so through that command, God established that every person has a right to life, right? He said people were created in God's image, and if you murder someone, that's problematic. And so now we're being told that, hey, that's just a Western construct. There's no objective basis for that idea. Of course we should be able to murder unborn babies with taxpayer money. Now we're openly talking about murdering babies after they're born, right? I mean, we're descending into absolute savagery and absolute barbarism, and this is a result of the war being waged on all the fruit of Christian civilization. Same thing with private property. You look at private property, for example, this is something that God ordained in the Bible. God said, "Thou shalt not steal." And the corollary to this is, of course, that you have private property. You can't steal something if there's no such thing as private property. And so God has ordained private property. And so there would be the advance of Marxism, communism, socialism, expropriation of land without compensation, increasingly ridiculous and confiscatory taxes, and on the list goes. Now we see the war on the family, right? We're being told that the patriarchy, the white Christian European model of the family is wrong, and now we need to have homosexual marriages. We need to have polyamory, where we have 3 or 4 or 5 sexual partners, and maybe they'll raise children together. I mean, this whole idea of a monogamous marriage between a man and a woman as kind of the nurturer of the next generation. This is now coming under attack. Even basic biological reality, right? God in the beginning created them male and female, right? So even now this basic fact that everybody can observe with their own 2 eyes, right? I mean, and if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, just look at the chromosomes, right? You're either a man or a woman. There's nothing in between. And even now this is coming under attack. And now we're being told that we're bigoted and hateful if we point out the biological fact that God created people as man and woman. And so I think what we're seeing now, it kind of takes the form of anti-white hysteria and just a demonization of all things white. But I think what it really is at its core is an effort to wipe out the civilization that was built based on the biblical worldview, based on the precepts that were revealed divinely through Scripture, and of course the attributes of God that we can determine, that we can see even just through the creation, right? I mean, a lot of God's attributes are revealed through the creation. Now even these are coming under attack. And so I think that's really what we're seeing. And I don't think these people will rest until Christians are either silent or in an apostate church that denies all the things that God has said, or are in, camps. And I think we're very quickly heading in that direction. Nobody wants to talk about it, but if you look at now the hysteria, the absolute hatred that is coming out of, for example, the LGBT movement or the African National Congress in South Africa, we see a very common parallel, and that is that these people are willing to use the most horrifying means possible to target their enemies. And I think it's going to get a lot worse, right? I think we're kind of in the beginning stages of this, and I think by the time this is all over, unless somehow this is turned around, I think it is going to end in absolute catastrophe. So I guess that's my kind of view on what this stems from and where it's all going.
Dan?
Well, and go ahead, Harry.
I sent you a collection of clips, YouTube clips, and I'm not sure whether it's possible to play the 4th one that I sent, but that will give it to you in blunt terms. You'll hear the situation in South Africa from a young representative of a group called Black First, Land First. And she tells the audience in no uncertain terms what it is they want. And I don't know if there's a way to play that.
Harry, I do have that. I do have that clip. I did not get a chance to transmit that to Joe McNeil, our producer. But we'll certainly talk about it on the other side of the break, because I think it's important for people to realize that this dynamic is designed to create strife, to create political opposition, to create the sort of animosity between races, between people, between cultures, between religions, that will end up ultimately in reducing population. And it goes back to that, because the bottom line is, according to UN Agenda 21, is that humans are a blight on the earth, and they need to reduce the human population to fewer than 1 billion people. So that is something they fully intend to do. They are very explicit about saying that they think humans are a blight on the earth, and in the process of creating all this racial, social, political, and religious strife, they are creating a climate that will result in a reduction in population, and that's exactly what they have in mind. We're moving into a break. We'll pick this up on the other side of the break.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching baits, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Today, my guests on the radio program are Dr. Harry Booyens and Alex Newman, and we are talking about the fundamental transformation of America and how now that the lunatics are really officially running the asylum, what's next? And with that, we left the conversation with Harry talking about how these changes are having a huge impact on our whole political process, and how we need to wake up to the reality is that we are going to be losing all of our freedoms if we don't stand up and take a very strong stand on this. Alex has said the same thing. I want to get back into this conversation, but apparently we've had a caller that called in that wants to talk with Dr. Booyens or Alex and has a question. And I don't want to keep him on the line any longer. He's been on for quite a long time. So with that, caller, please ask your question.
Good morning, Dan. Rick Bonner here. Yeah, my question is, it's an interesting thing. I have to kind of build it up. But as Dr. Booyens was saying and Alex is saying, we've got like around the world, dominoes falling. South Africa is one. Countries have just been thrown into the trash bin, it seems like. And I think it's because of two things. You folks have brought up earlier, the people feel like they have to be punished for their heritage. Like, it surprised me that there was a Viking heritage guy who thought that South Africans were a blight on Europe. Well, that's just some kind of a crazy masochism, but there are a lot of people that buy that. And unfortunately, there are some, like the ones who supposedly are in charge of South Africa. They have found themselves in the place to punish the offenders for, crimes that are imaginary crimes, like think it was Alex was saying, yeah, we're not complaining about the cars or the trains in South Africa. We just want to punish those white devils for making the land prosperous. But anyway, I just wondered what you all folks. Here's my question. Sorry for taking so long, Dan. I just wondered what you three gentlemen felt was a good way to put a stick in the spokes of the domino that's getting ready to topple all the way into the quagmire. America, for example. What can be done so that what has happened to places like South Africa doesn't continue to happen in the rest of the world? And certainly my main concern is America the beautiful. I thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, well, thank you, caller. Alex, why don't you grab that, and then we'll have Harry talk, because that's a great question. How do we stop this domino effect from destroying our Christian civilization in the United States?
Yeah, well, thank you to the caller. Really appreciate it. And I think that's the question everybody who loves freedom, who loves their country, who loves their family, who loves their church needs to be asking themselves is, what do we do to prevent what happened in South Africa from happening in the United States? Because if we don't, we're toast. And I've spent many, many years thinking about this, and I've come to the conclusion that the only feasible, realistic approach to this is to focus on the education of children. Right now, we're in a situation where about 87% of America's children are in government indoctrination centers 5 days a week, for 6 to 8 hours per day for about 13 years. And then they go to 4 more years of radicalized indoctrination masquerading as a university education, with a few exceptions in terms of, if you're getting a degree in actually something useful like engineering or medicine. But even there, you get a lot of it. So I've recognized that this is probably our main problem, because all day, every day, these poor kids in these government schools are being not only dumbed down. The dumbing down is criminal. It's bad enough that, they're using quack methods to teach reading that have been exposed as quackery since the 1840s, that, end up mass-producing illiteracy and reading disabilities. That's all bad enough. But then they're indoctrinating the kids to, first of all, hate themselves, hate their own history, disagree with their parents, turn against their churches, and basically allow or encourage what happened to South Africa to happen to the United States. And if we allow this to continue unimpeded, it's all over. Even if we say, okay, well, 10% of the kids are being homeschooled, they're in good Christian schools, private schools, they'll receive a decent education, they'll have some understanding of history. If we're outnumbered 10-1, it's over, right? I mean, the South Africans experienced that, and they weren't outnumbered 10-1. And I think the solution then, which is I think what the caller was asking for, so what is the solution? And I think the solution is, first of all, to expose the government indoctrination centers, and second, to get parents in massive numbers, by the millions, to withdraw their children from public education. And, unfortunately, I realize that sounds radical to a lot of people. I realize that a lot of people will say, well, we need 2 incomes, we can't do that. Well, we need, vacation, we need a nice car, we can't afford that. Okay, what's more important to you, a second vacation or a nice car, or the minds and the souls of your children and the future of liberty in your country? And we actually produced a special report in the New American. It was released on February 4th. We dedicated the entire issue of the New American magazine to precisely this question. And, it applies as much to the subversion of our liberties as it does to all these other issues. All these issues that we care about. Gun rights, abortion, limited government, Christian civilization, all these issues that we care about, we're going to lose on every single one if we continue allowing the government to indoctrinate all of our children. So we recommend that parents immediately get their children out of the government schools. We recommend that people order 100 or 1,000 copies of the special report and give it to your pastor, because we need every pastor in the country warning their congregations about what's going on. We recommend that you give it to your neighbor if they have children. Get it to the opinion molders in your community. And we need a mass exodus from the public education system. I think that would give us a real chance to set back this agenda. And I think, no matter what we do, we can educate older Americans all we like, but the reality is at some point we're all going to die, and our kids and our grandkids are going to be taking over. And as long as they are being indoctrinated to the point where they're not only willing to allow the subversion of their liberty in their country, but they're actually hoping to see that happen, we're going to lose on every single battle. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Now, that's an excellent point, Alex, and that's the reality. If we don't take our youth back, if we don't really bring back good education and history and teach our young people how important freedom is, they're going to lose every bit of it, and they won't even know it happened. Harry, you jump in on this too, please.
Yeah, I said I went and found the thing that ails the West. I found it in the 1700s. I think the thing to fix it can also be found there. It was called the Enlightenment, and basically is the introduction of the Age of Reason. But here's the thing. I speak to Americans. Why do I talk to Americans about this? Because, in my humble opinion, it's the one nation that raised its kids to tell the difference between right and wrong, more so than anybody else that I have dealt with in my life. Don't let this go to your heads, but that's the way I have experienced Americans. When it all comes down to brass tacks, they can tell right from wrong, rather better than most other people. But why are they getting it wrong then? And in my opinion, the problem is your media. It is profoundly sick. It is deeply, deeply, deeply flawed and deeply sick. And my best way of expressing that to you is always remember Lenin was a newspaper man. And oddly, the first issue of his newspaper had an article about the Afrikaners of South Africa. So they've been harping on us ever since the beginning. Now, what to do about that? I cannot tell you exactly what to do in the United States, but I can tell you a simple thing on the ground, and that is, I listen to what commentators are saying about how much these grand new ideas are going to cost that your Democratic Party is talking about. They're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands per individual American taxpayer. I have a much simpler suggestion. Put aside $1,000 to $1,500. Go down to the flight center or to Expedia or whatever, get hold of them and buy an air ticket to South Africa. Go and look at your future and decide if you want it. That's what it'll take. It's a lot less than hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's less than a university education. It's less than pretty much most things that count. Just go there and see for yourself what the truth looks like and whether this is the truth you want for your country. Because a lot of folks talk about this, but none of them are there to see what hell looks like.
No, you're right, Harry. And the thing that so many of these travel agencies that are selling the idea of South Africa, they sell the resort areas, but they don't sell the countryside. They need to get out and spend some time in farm country with the Boers.
Yeah. Yeah, get hold of me. I'll connect you with a farmer to go and spend a week with. They'd love to have you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great idea. Incidentally, I have to tell you, I bought a DVD set. It's Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, thinking, well, I want to see everybody's perspective. I want to see what the untold history is. I had no idea, but apparently Oliver Stone is a unashamed progressive socialist and a Marxist, because his untold history says that Franklin Roosevelt was a wonderful savior of humanity, and that Joe Stalin was a really good guy, and that together they could have saved the world had it not been for those hateful capitalists and those people that really put an end to those hardcore right-wingers, as he refers to them. that put an end to that wonderful association and made the United States and the Soviet Union adversaries.
Dan, you do
and
know that
obviously
Hollywood...
he's just like the rest of the progressives that make up so much of our culture today.
Dan, you do know that Hollywood made a movie called Mission to Moscow, right?
Well, I've heard of it, but I can't say that I've seen the movie.
It's the one that Roosevelt specifically asked be made in order to make Stalin palatable to Americans.
Yeah, well, and in reality, you know, the people have to understand one thing: the same people who are in control of our financial system, the same people who have made fortunes off of the industrial freedom that capitalism allowed them, that set up these foundations that are now the ones that are promoting the progressive socialism and the destruction of free enterprise, because they've got theirs and they don't want the rest of us to have that same freedom of opportunity. Alex, I want you to weigh in on that, please.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, such a key point right there, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier. You know, the fruit of Christian civilization has been a blessing to all of humanity. You know, even the concept of human rights, the Europeans like to think they're so enlightened. You know, the post-Christian Europeans like to think they're so enlightened with their human rights, not realizing that the entire concept of human rights comes, legitimate human rights at least, not the communist bastardization of it where they claim you have a human right to government health care and government education and so on. But the concept of human rights, the idea that we all have an inherent dignity, a right to life, a right to our property, a right to our family life, this all is rooted in the biblical worldview. So when you sever the foundations of that, you lose the fruit of that, which is, of course, a respect for individual freedom, the free market that has allowed prosperity to surge to unprecedented heights. And we are going to lose all of this fruit that people seem to appreciate. You know, people seem to like their liberty. People seem to like their highfalutin lifestyles with their fancy cars and their nice apartments and their air conditioning and their, you know, nice food and all the rest of it. But they don't recognize that this all is dependent on the foundation of Christian civilization. And to go back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, Dan, you know, you talked about the UN agenda and how they're so anxious to reduce the population of human beings. It goes right back to what I was saying earlier. You know, if God created people in his image, then we should expect that the enemy would hate people and would want less people. So if you go to, like, the book of Genesis, God says, you know, that he told people that they should be fruitful, that they should multiply, that they should subdue the earth. And so what we see with the United Nations, whether we're looking at Agenda 21 or UN Agenda 2030 or any of these other declarations, they all have something in common, and that is they all seek to overturn the command that God gave people to be fruitful, to multiply, and to subdue the earth. So now they tell us that we shouldn't have children because it's bad for global warming. We should leave most of the area of the world as wilderness habitat for some lizard or some, you know, owl or whatever. And that humans should be confined, the humans that at least are allowed to continue to exist should be confined to these, you know, super high density, tiny little apartment units where they can, you know, walk to their job and walk to their food and all the rest of it. It's very dangerous. And I think, unfortunately, you know, going back to the schools, the American people and people around the world have no idea anymore that all of these things they take for granted, their liberties, their prosperity, their security, you know, they're not having to be terrified that they're going to be, you know, killed if they walk outside their house and things like that. They take it all for granted, and they don't recognize that it all is rooted in Christian civilization. So we have a very big problem, and I think as we lose this, and you know, it's ironic, because as we lose this, we start seeing negative consequences, and then they blame those negative consequences on what little remains of Christian civilization, what little remains of constitutional limited government and the church and things like that. So, you know, now all problems are suddenly caused by, you know, white Christian men, for example, right? And, you know, it's just a spiral downwards, and if we don't address it, it's going to be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, you like Harry was saying, if you want to see your future, get an airplane ticket and fly to South Africa, because that's where we're heading. You have the leaders of the country singing. That's when I first started really focusing in on South Africa, when I saw President Jacob Zuma singing about in front of his military, saying, "Bring me my machine gun, we're going to go shoot all the Boers." And you had Dr. Gregory Stanton, the world's leading expert on genocide, warning that they were now in the planning and preparation phase for genocide. And it's sad that it's something so blatant to finally realize what was going on. But most of the world still hasn't realized what was going on. The leadership of South Africa is now doing, animal sacrifices and worshiping ancestors and all these kinds of things. And, if they want to do that, that's fine. But this is, again, not just a symptom, but it is the actual severing of the foundations upon which the prosperity and the liberty and the security were built. And nobody wants to talk about it, but we need to talk about it if we're going to preserve those things.
Yeah. If I can just say that the reason why I focused in on the media is that I believe that Americans will wake up and will stand up for what is right if they know what's going on. But their media refuses the truth. Like CNN, for example, is abjectly refusing to report the truth about what's going on in South Africa. They deny the farm killings, for example. They just will not report it. They don't do it.
Yeah, Harry, and tell our listeners, being a farmer in South Africa, a white farmer in South Africa, you have probably the highest chance of being murdered of any group in the world, including active military.
That's right. I originally wrote in 2006. I gave the stats that at that stage you stood a bigger chance of being killed as a South African farmer than as American troops in Iraq. So, and those were just the hard numbers. Today, the amongst their group, in other words, the per thousand number, the per thousand death rate, murder rate of white farmers in South Africa is higher than the rate of death among the police in the most violent country on earth. What does that tell you? And there used to be 80,000 farmers. They're down to something like 35,000. And, what happens next? I don't even know what to tell you. I can play you endless YouTube video clips by victims, but folks don't want to listen. It perturbs the sort of, sensitive disposition of liberal people. They can't afford to hear the truth. I was on a riverboat on the at the time it was the Danube in Europe through Germany. I'm on this riverboat, and I had this problem that every time I sat down to dinner, they wanted us to sit with someone else every night. So it was my misfortune to sit down across the table from an American gentleman and a wife from, I don't know where. It looked like maybe it was Indonesia or somewhere there, Malaysia. And so the lady asked me, so what is it like now in South Africa? And I explained, well, I have a friend who's now moved to Canada. His brother was murdered by having fencing wire tied around his neck, and then he was slowly choked to death while the killers sat next to him eating lunch. At this point, the guy starts to scream in the dining room on this boat. He starts yelling, "Please, God, stop, stop, stop." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Your wife asked me what it's like." And he tells me, "Harry, I see the pain. I see the pain." They don't want to know.
Yeah, that's the truth. They don't want to know. They may pretend that they're concerned that they ask, but in reality, they don't want to see it. It's cognitive dissonance. They they just don't want to know what reality really is. And frankly, your comment about the media controlling that whole dialogue, it's absolutely true. They control the dialogue, and through education, they are stealing the minds of future generations. And when they get what they want, it will be so much worse than anybody envisions. And it's time that we either wake up or we're screwed.
Yeah, I don't have a smart comment to add to any of that. You know, at this stage, Dan, quite frankly, most South Africans are so worn down. The world is just not listening. It refuses to see. When it gets confronted by facts, it denies them. As I told folks, make peace with a concept that they want you dead, pal. They want you dead. I know, because one of them told me to my face, as I said earlier. They want you dead.
Well, and Harry, it isn't even a matter of just South Africans. If they achieve their ultimate goal of reducing the world's population by 93% to a sustainable level, what they call a sustainable level, it will be an awful lot of people around the world are going to see those kinds of programs being implemented in their countries. And it's time that people wake up to the reality. The reason they want to reduce the human population is because they want to control everything we do from cradle to grave, and everything in our lives they want to be able to control. And frankly, there are too many people for them to be able to control without reducing that population significantly.
I want to pick up on something that Alex said earlier, and you've just triggered me on that. Alex made the comment that the people who kind of built up the financial system of the world are the same ones conniving now. I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth thereby, but something essentially along those lines. And I actually have an interesting little bit on that subject. You know, in 1899, there was the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa when Britain wanted the gold in the Transvaal province, or the Transvaal Republic, and so Britain eventually sent 400,000 men to fight 40,000 farmers, which, just for the record, is what Mark Twain predicted. He was there before that war, and he said it's going to take 400,000 British to keep these guys down, and that's exactly what they said, 400,000. Now, in Christmas of 1901, the following was sent to every British soldier who was at that stage in 1901 putting Afrikaner women and children in concentration camps where 57% of my Boyan's family died. And here's what these soldiers received in the Christmas of 1901. It was a little box that contained a hamper with candy, some stationery, a portion of tobacco, a pipe, 12 packets of cigarettes, a book, a chocolate cake, a plum pudding, and a deck of cards. And on the box was a nice little seal that read, "With the compliments of the season from Lord Rothschild, Mr. Alfred de Rothschild, and Mr. Leopold de Rothschild." For those that don't know, those were the senior bankers of the Western world at that stage. So that was the hamper they sent to the guys who was putting my family in concentration camps.
Wow. That is an eye-opener, Harry. That is an eye-opener. That is absolutely amazing. Alex, I want to get you back into this conversation because I know you've got just an amazing amount of information to bring to this discussion. What say you about the role of international financial elites in the progressive movement?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that, and I've kind of focused on that. But I think we're going to the break right now. So
yeah, we are going to the break. Let me pick that up on the other side of the break with you starting the conversation. Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today our guests on the radio show are Dr. Harry Booyens and Alex Newman. And before we get back into the discussion, I want to remind our listeners just how important it is to support this radio network and support this radio program with your financial help. We need you to make sure that we stay on the air and that we spread the message of liberty worldwide, and we're doing that through the efforts of people around the world who are very, very interested in the programs that we're doing. And we are hearing, I'm hearing through my podcasting folks that we are now reaching listeners in 20 countries around the world. It's important that you provide the financial help to make sure that this program and programs like it on this network get spread around the world. We are the message of freedom, and without your help, we cannot continue to provide that message. So please, get on board and put your money where your mouth is, because we need it. We need the help that you can provide, and we need to make sure that this message gets out all over the world, and that's what we're all about. So, Alex, you were just getting ready to start talking about the financial connections and some of the things that Harry was talking about, Lord Rothschild providing the Christmas package for the British troops in 1901. It's been that way for a very, very long time. The people who they think, the so-called common people, the socialists and the Marxists, they think they're fighting against the financial elites, and that they're going to bring all these great things to the people of the world. And the fact is, the people they're fighting are the ones that are funding this.
That's exactly right, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about this, because it's such a major deception. And even normal, generally clear-thinking people have this idea that communists, at least communist leaders, have always been at odds with super capitalists, so-called. And the reality is just the opposite, and there's so much evidence. If you go straight back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, you realize that their manifesto was actually commissioned by the so-called League of the Just, and there were some very, very powerful financial interests involved here, and this pattern has continued all the way through to the present day. I think one of the most important and revealing books on this subject, it actually blew my mind when I first read it, because it shattered everything I had been taught about communism and the communist world versus what used to be called the free world. And this is a book by Anthony Sutton. I think he's one of America's premier historians. It's called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And what he shows is that some of America's leading financiers, some of the wealthiest mega bankers in the country, literally financed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And when people hear that, that's like incredible. No way, that can't possibly be, right? The Bolsheviks, they were going to destroy the capitalists. Well, you've been duped, right? And this has, again, continued all the way to the present day. I just recently wrote a very in-depth article about the takeover of Cuba. And again, we see the exact same thing happen. You see moneyed interests, particularly involved with and surrounding the Council on Foreign Relations, that were at every step of the way helping Fidel Castro to gain control over Cuba. So you had Herbert Matthews, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, publishing in the New York Times a bunch of easily discredited propaganda that Fidel Castro was some sort of George Washington for Cuba, and he was an anti-communist, and he was going to free Cuba from tyranny. Of course, sensible people like Robert Welch were warning that he was a communist and that he was going to enslave Cuba. And, of course, he was. But you had the State Department vigorously working to put Castro in power. Our ambassador to Cuba at the time, Earl Smith, was warning the State Department, hey, this guy's a communist, you guys are crazy, what are you doing, stop it. And then he later testified before the Senate that the U.S. government really was responsible for putting Castro to power. He would not have been put in power without the direct support of the U.S. government, and especially the kind of subversive organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, where the Rockefellers played a leading role. He never would have come to power. And, we have all kinds of admissions from these people about this. If you look, for example, at Carroll Quigley, who really was an establishment insider. He was Bill Clinton's mentor. And he actually had an opportunity for several years to examine the papers of what now is called in the popular lexicon the deep state. And what he said was, I actually agree with these goals. I agree with this agenda. I just disagree with the secrecy. And he writes in his book, Tragedy and Hope, that a lot of these, what we call the deep state today, were working and partnering with the communists, and in fact that they behave very much in the way that what he called the radical right thinks communists operate, and they're not shy about cooperating and working with communists. And it takes me back, I feel like I sound like a broken record, but it takes me back to what we were discussing earlier. And, this is not about the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie, despite what you may have been taught in your government school, despite what you may have been told by your fake media. I think one of the most important books ever written on communism and Marxism, if you really want to understand what's going on here, it was written by Pastor Richard Wurmbrand. He was a pastor in communist Romania who was imprisoned in a communist prison camp and tortured brutally for many years. And he wrote a book called Marx and Satan. And what he shows is that, Marx always pretended to be an atheist, right? At least after he dropped the mask and as a formal communist, he always said, well, religion is the opiate of the masses, and we're more sophisticated than that. But if you read his poetry, some of which is quoted in this book, what becomes immediately apparent is that this wasn't so much a rejection of God as it was a hatred of God. And I think that is what communism is all about, and that is why we find families and very powerful financial interests like the Rockefeller dynasty, like the Rothschild dynasty, cooperating with communists who, you would think they would pose an existential threat. And there's so many examples of this. So let's take Rockefeller as another example. David Rockefeller was one of the key people involved with the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the founder of the Trilateral Commission, and we talk about this all in a special report we did for the New American about the deep state. You can get it as an ebook on Amazon if you're interested, or you can get the actual report from the New American by going to the website. But what you have is you had Rockefeller who went over to China in the early 1970s, and he came back and he wrote in the New York Times that the social experiment, as he described it, under Chairman Mao was among the most important and successful in human history. Of course, the social experiment involved the complete obliteration of China's ancient culture. It involved the collectivization of the economy. It involved the slaughter of 60 to 80 million innocent people. And anybody who would call that a success has got something wrong in their head. Right? I mean unless you think of mass murder as success, something very clearly is wrong with you. And yet you have David Rockefeller writing this openly in the New York Times. Later on in his life, he wrote in his book, Memoirs, that sometimes people accuse him and his family of conspiring with a secret cabal against the best interests of the United States to build a one-world order, where, of course, he didn't say this explicitly, but this is very clearly part of the agenda, where this old Soviet world, the communist world, would be merged with the so-called free world. And he says, if that's the charge, I'm guilty, and I'm proud of it. So you have these people openly bragging about this. You have smoking guns all over the place, proving that the mega financial interests, the extremely powerful financial interests, take the Rothschilds, for example. Niall Ferguson, an apologist for the Rothschild banking dynasty, wrote in his book that the Rothschild dynasty decided the outcome of the war between the French and the British 200 years ago. These were two of the most powerful governments in the world, and here you have this Rothschild family deciding the outcome. You have even more recently Baron Eric de Rothschild, one of the Rothschild bigwigs in France. I came across his name on an open letter supporting an actual communist, Irina Bokova of the Bulgarian Communist Party, which slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. This Rothschild was promoting her to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. So this, from the beginning, this has been a movement of the elites, I would argue, diabolical elites, and the goal always very clearly, I think, has been to eliminate Western Christian civilization and all that entails, liberty and the church and all the rest of it. So I think when you really look at what's happening here, you see that this is a very, very evil agenda. This idea that communists are fighting capitalists is, in fact, a hoax. It's just not true. And if you look at the evidence, it's very clear. And I think Harry's anecdote about Lord Rothschild, encouraging British troops to basically crush the little Afrikaner republics, I think it's just another example of the mountains of evidence proving this. And so I'm glad he brought it out.
No, if I may, Dan.
Go ahead, Eric.
We have a situation now in South Africa that kind of demonstrates some of this that Alex has explained. When the previous president, Jacob Zuma, was sort of in the process of being dethroned inside of the ANC party that he leads. So if you become the president of the ANC, you pretty much automatically become president of the country. So while they were busy kicking him out of his seat, he threatened that he would reveal where the money came from for the ANC as a communist party in 1994. And he was mentioning how business jets were being provided to some of these guys. And he said, he made comments along the lines of, where do you think these guys suddenly got their ground houses from? Okay. And he started listing particular groups of exceedingly rich businessmen and financiers, both in South Africa and particularly in London. So people have been waiting for him to spill the beans on this whole lot. But it's very clear that the bigger organizations, bigger financial organizations, such as, for example, Lonmin, settled in London, which runs platinum mines in South Africa, they just immediately gave major shares in their operations to individuals such as the present president. Okay, so you have these big finance guys literally dumping cash by the many millions of communist leaders in South Africa. So it's not as though it's a secret.
No, and it's never been a secret, at least for the people that are in the know, that the same people who are talking about the proletariat and how the common man needs to control and I guess property ought to be controlled by the collective and all the rest. The same people who are promoting that are the people who've profited the most from free enterprise, and I do believe that it's their way of making sure that they can keep what they have and in destroying any opportunity for others to achieve that same enormous amount of success, because it looks to them like competition.
The other thing is, if I may, I asked earlier whether a certain clip can be played. I have that lined up and could play it for you and your audience right now if you wanted to.
Yeah, please do, Harry. That would be good. I'm sorry that I couldn't do that. You do it.
I hope it gets through the system well enough. This is an organization that is sort of South Africa's equivalent of Black Lives Matter. It is a thing called Black First, Land First. And this spokesperson, a young lady, is being interviewed by Lauren Southern, who happens to be a Canadian girl she lives here close nearby us. And she went to South Africa to make a movie called Farmlands, which people should take a look at. She gets some little things wrong about the history, but that's not that serious. And this is a clip that came about in the process of her going around the country. So here you have Black First, Land First, stating what it is they want to do.
We don't want your handovers. We don't want you to feel pity for us. We are coming for you, and we are going to get everything that you owe.
Is that clear enough?
It's the accent, but if you would repeat what was said after the quotes and her actual voice, then I think our audience would appreciate that.
Okay. So he's basically saying, we don't want your handovers, we don't want you to feel pity for us, we are coming for you, we are going to get everything that you own, it is ours.
Okay.
Is that clear enough for
That's
folks to
pretty darn
understand
clear.
the purpose?
Yeah, that's pretty clear.
Okay, so that's what you're up against, in case you didn't know.
Well,
We're
I
coming
think
for
we
you.
do
We're
know
coming
here,
for you.
but
We're gonna
Alex,
get everything you
I
own.
want you
It
to
is
weigh in
ours.
on this too.
Yeah, I think that it was a very good quote because I think it illustrates danger very well. You know, they typically don't talk like that openly, although that is, of course, their agenda. But they literally are coming for everything, not just what you own, mind you. You know, that really understates the problem because they're not just after your material wealth, and they are after your material wealth. They want your money. They want you to be reduced to poverty, and I think they've made that very clear. But it's beyond that. You know, they're not just happy with your material wealth. They want your children. They want your country. They want your churches. They want your mind. And they are willing to do absolutely anything to get it. You know, they're not held back by these moral scruples. If you read their strategists, you know, in terms of how do we accomplish this? You know, okay, let's start off with the goal that we want to take all their stuff. We want to, you know, basically subjugate them. How do we do that? Take, for example, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky was probably the most influential community organizer of all time. He was an inspiration to Obama. Hillary Clinton actually wrote her thesis on Saul Alinsky. So if you read his book, Rules for Radicals, and when I went to go work for the Leadership Institute, that was the first thing they made me do. They said, here's Rules for Radicals, read it because you need to understand what the other side is doing. So I did. And it was just shocking. You know, I mean, first of all, the very beginning was shocking. He actually dedicates the book to Lucifer. No joke. Right in the beginning, it says that this book is dedicated to Lucifer. And as you read on, you realize that these people come from the mindset that everything is fair game if it advances their agenda. They really believe in this philosophy of the ends justifies the means. The ends is taking everything you own and subjugating you, and the means can be anything, right? They can lie, they can steal, they can cheat, they can kill to accomplish that. And I think South Africa kind of got to experience it first, but we are now moving very rapidly in that direction. And I want people to recognize what is at stake here. It's not just your material stuff. That's all at stake, right? I mean, if you think you're going to be allowed to live in a nice house and drive a nice car if you just keep your head down, you're wrong, right? I mean, it's like the one who fed the other people to the alligator hoping he'd get eaten last. Well, you're going to get eaten too, right? But it's not just your stuff. They want your mind, your children, your churches, and eventually your life. So it's all on the line. I don't want to sound doomy and gloomy. I'm actually, if people ask me, how can you be so happy and smiling all the time, doing all this stuff, And I said, well, that's very simple. My trust is completely in God, and my God is far more powerful than these people and their little schemes. That doesn't mean nothing bad will ever happen to me or any of us, but I think first and foremost we need to recognize that we need to have our faith in God through these battles, because on our own we are completely incapable of overcoming this. And second of all, I want everybody to realize that it's all on the line. If you think you can just sit back and do nothing and let other people do the fighting for you, and I don't mean literal fighting, I mean figurative fighting and resisting this agenda, you're wrong too. You must get involved, or you're going to lose it all. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And we do these pleas for people to fund and help us keep these radio programs on the air. And that's such a small thing. I mean, people should realize that we are losing our entire way of life, and very likely we're going to lose our lives as a result of the changes that are proposed. And Alex, you referred to Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky. I think you and I are concerned about this because we see things happening in the freedom movement, where insiders are, or let's say outsiders, are worming their way into the inside, and they're taking over organizations in ways that are absolutely amazing. And they're winning because people, our side for the most part, are too trusting. Our side for the most part are too willing to allow the other side the benefit of the doubt. Well, the fact is, the benefit of the doubt is the destruction of our country. That's what it's all about. Alex, are you still on? I heard kind of a funny sound, but I want to get your comment, and then I want to get Harry's comment as well.
Yes, I'm still on, and I couldn't agree more with you, Dan. You know, it's all on the line. We all need to get involved, and you know, getting involved is different for everybody. You know, everybody has their own gifts that God has endowed them with. You know, some people are good at earning money, and if you're good at earning money, then support radio shows like this one. If you're good at you know, speaking or writing, well, get speaking and get writing. You know, everybody has something they can do. Even if it's just as simple as pulling your kids out of the public school system and giving them a decent education. You know, that is so huge. All the little things that we do have such a tremendous impact. So I hope that, you know, people will come away from this not, you know, in despair, but recognizing that we really do have to work if we're going to preserve our freedom, if we're going to preserve our families, if we're going to preserve our country. And, you know, again, it might be something small. Everybody has their own part to contribute, but everybody who's listening to this and everybody you know needs to get involved now. You know, we don't want to wait until it's too late and it's hopeless. We want to get involved now while we still have a chance of holding these people back.
Oh, that's right. Harry, I want to give you an opportunity, and then I'd like to have you talk a little bit about how folks can learn more about your work and some of the things that you're involved in, and how they can contact you.
Okay, the how to see the stuff I'm working on and what I'm doing is real simple. All folks need to put the following word into Google, and that is AMABHULU. AMABHULU. They'll find my blog, they'll find the book, they'll find various YouTube things, etc. So that's all there. Dan, what else would you like me to address?
Well, I want to give Alex the opportunity. We're running out of time. I want to give Alex the opportunity to talk a little about his books and about New American Magazine, and then if we have time, I'd like to have you talk about what you would see as the best way to stop this. But let's give Alex the opportunity first.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for having me on the program. And, Harry, thank you for everything you've done to bring out some of this kind of unknown history and bring this light to this important issue. You mentioned, Harry, you mentioned the media as being so crucial. I couldn't agree more with you. You know, the battle over truth and information is just absolutely critical here. And speaking of that, I really encourage people to sign up for the New American Magazine. You know, we have an online portal. You can get daily headlines. You know, all that is for free. And then I really encourage people to go and subscribe to the print version of the magazine. It's, you know, it'll cost you like nothing, right? I mean, a copy per week or something, and you can have access to 2 issues every month, bringing you the most important information that you need to know without the spin, without the lies, without the deception. And, you know, the very first principle, the very first thing, the first point that we need is accurate information. If you don't have accurate information, you are not going to be able to successfully resist this agenda. You're not going to be able to successfully do what needs to be done. And so I encourage people to get the New American Magazine. Go to thenewamerican.com to find it, and then, you know, just stay up to speed on developments, because that's, you know, in my opinion, I write for it because I think it's the best source of information. And you'll stay up to speed on everything you need to know about South Africa, about the United Nations, about what the other side is doing in this war on faith, freedom, and family. And there you go. So thank you very much again, Dan, for having me, and thank you, Harry, for everything you're doing.
Well, thank you, Alex. And incidentally, I want to mention your book, Crimes of the Educators, and that is available on Amazon. Am I right?
That's right, yep.
Okay. Harry, very quickly, tell our listeners what you think the future of America is unless they act now.
Well, the future of America is South Africa. It's already a good distance along the road to that. So, again, folks need to find out more about South Africa and demand that the news media tell them more about it. I would like to leave this with one simple little comment, and it breaks my heart to say it. The first South African white farming family has arrived in Mexico and asked for asylum in the United States.
Isn't that sad? And they probably won't get it unless Trump hears about it, because the reality is that they don't want those people here. They want all the indigenous people here. So with that, I ask our listeners to please join us again next week for Connecting the Dots. And gentlemen, thank you for being our guests today, and I look forward to the next time we get an opportunity to visit.
Thank you, Dan.